The first disappearance did not cause alarm. In the Colonial record, absence was ordinary. Children vanished from censuses as crops failed or ships arrived, their names erased by distance, disease, or the convenience of ink. The officials who kept those ledgers understood this. They relied on it. Orphans, especially, were expected to fade. They belonged to no lineage powerful enough to demand explanation, no household wealthy enough to insist on accounting. When a child had no mother to testify and no father to threaten reprisal, the margin of the page was considered sufficient grave. The institutions meant to shelter them were themselves provisional things. Orphan houses were rarely built of stone. They were converted warehouses, decommissioned barracks, parish halls smelling of damp wood and boiled grain. Children slept in rows, their bodies arranged for easy counting, their names written on slates that could be wiped clean when a ship arrived. The caretakers were not cruel in the theatrical sense. They were methodical. They fed, washed, prayed, and disciplined according to schedules devised by men who never entered the dormitories. The purpose was not comfort but order. Order could be audited. Order could be justified to the crown. What the children did not know, and what the ledgers did not record, was that these orphan houses sat along invisible routes, paths not marked on maps, but traced in correspondence between colonial administrators, physicians, and investors. Letters written in formal, restrained language spoke of supply, availability, and materials appropriate for instruction. They avoided the word child. They avoided the word body. Instead, they spoke of age ranges, physical condition, and absence of familial claim. The orphans were valuable not because they were unwanted, but because they were unclaimed. The laboratories were not laboratories as later centuries would imagine them. They were rooms within forts, annexes of hospitals, converted kitchens, and locked basements beneath academies. Their tools were modest, scalpels sharpened by hand, glass jars imported at great expense, wooden restraints polished smooth by use. The men who worked there called themselves surgeons, natural philosophers, anatomists. Some had trained in Europe. Others learned by watching and repeating. All of them were authorized by the same silence that protected the orphan houses. They did not need explicit permission to take a child. They only needed the absence of objection. Transportation was quiet. Children were told they were being apprenticed, relocated, given opportunity. In some cases, this was true, just not in the way the word implied. A cart would arrive before dawn. Names were checked against lists that did not exist in the official record. A mark was placed beside each entry in a private ledger. The children were instructed not to speak. They were not frightened yet. Fear required context. What they felt was confusion, and confusion was easier to manage. In the laboratory spaces, the rules were different. Silence was not requested but enforced. The children were washed again, inspected again, measured. Notes were taken on bone length, skin elasticity, reaction to pressure. These observations were framed as neutral. Curiosity was described as necessity. When pain occurred, it was recorded as response. The language flattened experience into data, stripping it of protest. The men believed, or claimed to believe, that knowledge demanded sacrifice, and that sacrifice was more efficient when it came from those who would not be missed. Some experiments were observational. Children were fed controlled diets to observe growth patterns. Others were subjected to exposure, heat, cold, confined air, to study endurance. There were inoculations administered without explanation, incisions made to observe healing, substances applied to skin to test absorption. Death was not the goal, but neither was survival guaranteed. When a child did not wake, the body was documented, dissected, and rendered into specimens. Organs were preserved, bones were cleaned. A new line was drawn through a name in a ledger that remained hidden. The justifications were consistent. Orphans, it was argued, were already victims of circumstance. To extract knowledge from their suffering was to redeem it. The rhetoric framed cruelty as stewardship. It suggested that the empire's future health depended on these quiet transactions. Diseases needed understanding. Environments needed mapping onto bodies. The Colonial project required resilience, and resilience could be engineered if one knew where the human frame failed. These were not arguments made publicly. They circulated in correspondence sealed with wax, read by men who nodded and passed them along. Resistance did occur, though rarely in ways that survived the record. A caretaker might delay a cart, claim illness, miscount children. A surgeon might falsify a report to protect a subject he had come to see as more than material. These acts were small and dangerous. When discovered, they were disciplined not as moral failures but as breaches of protocol. Order had to be preserved. The system depended on predictability. Any sentiment that threatened efficiency was considered a weakness to be corrected. The children themselves developed strategies, though few were effective. Some learned to feign sickness in ways that made them undesirable. Others attempted escape, only to be recaptured and returned with wrists bound more tightly. A few formed attachments with staff, believing that proximity to authority might offer protection. It rarely did. Attachment was a liability. It created witnesses. Witnesses had to be managed. The most disturbing aspect was not the pain inflicted, but the normalcy that surrounded it. Outside the laboratory walls, life continued. Markets opened, churches filled. Governors hosted dinners where health and progress were toasted. The experiments were not aberrations. They were integrated into the rhythm of colonial administration. Reports summarizing findings were sent back to Europe, where they informed medical texts and military guidelines. The suffering of unnamed children became footnotes in the advancement of science. Occasionally, a question surfaced. A parish priest might notice discrepancies in baptismal records. A visiting inspector might inquire about declining numbers. These questions were answered with references to disease outbreaks, relocations, or clerical error. The explanations were plausible because they aligned with existing assumptions about orphan mortality. The truth required a level of suspicion that threatened the legitimacy of multiple institutions. Most chose not to pursue it. Over time, the laboratories evolved. Techniques refined themselves. New instruments arrived. The children continued to arrive as well, though their origins shifted as wars and famines altered populations. In some regions, the supply diminished, prompting discussions about expanding criteria. Poverty became sufficient. Illegitimacy became sufficient. The boundary between orphan and unwanted child blurred, then dissolved. The system adjusted without public declaration, absorbing new categories into its quiet economy. There were moments when the weight of it pressed through the silence. A shipment delayed by weather left children confined longer than planned, their cries audible beyond the laboratory walls. A fire exposed a basement room filled with jars and tags bearing dates instead of names. These incidents produced brief discomfort, followed by administrative response. Investigations were announced, limited, concluded. Recommendations were issued and filed. The work continued. The men who authored the reports aged and retired. Some returned to Europe, their careers advanced by discoveries made possible through anonymous suffering. Others died in the colonies, buried with honors that mentioned service and innovation. None of their memorials referenced the children. The orphan houses persisted, their walls repainted, their dormitories rearranged. New caretakers were trained. The routes remained. When the empire began to fracture, when records were moved, burned, or lost, the laboratories vanished from official memory. Buildings were repurposed. Basements were sealed. Specimens were transferred to collections stripped of provenance. The private ledgers, if they survived at all, were scattered among estates or destroyed by descendants who did not wish to know. The children existed only as absences, gaps in parish lists, anomalies in demographic tables, unaccounted years. Yet the knowledge produced endured. It informed practices long after the context was forgotten. Textbooks cited findings without naming their sources. Procedures developed in those rooms were standardized, taught, repeated. The origins were irrelevant to their utility. Progress does not require remembrance, only results. In rare cases, fragments resurface. A letter misfiled, a ledger discovered behind a false wall, a set of bones identified through modern methods that restore age and injury to anonymous remains. These fragments do not tell complete stories. They resist narrative closure. They offer only glimpses of a system that thrived on partial visibility. To reconstruct it fully would require acknowledging that cruelty was not an accident but a method chosen and maintained. The discomfort of this acknowledgement lies in its implications. It suggests that the boundary between care and exploitation is thinner than institutions admit. That vulnerability, when organized and documented, becomes a resource. The orphans were not taken because they were invisible. They were made invisible so they could be taken. Their disappearance was not a failure of oversight but a success of design. As the century turned, reforms were announced. Child welfare laws were drafted. Ethical standards were articulated. The language changed, but the past was not addressed. There were no apologies for unnamed children, no memorials for those whose bodies became data. Silence was preserved as continuity. To speak would have required confronting beneficiaries still living, systems still functioning. The orphan houses eventually closed or transformed. Their buildings absorbed into expanding cities. Few plaques marked their existence. Fewer still hint at what lay beneath. The laboratories, if acknowledged at all, are framed as precursors to modern medicine, their moral cost abstracted into historical necessity. The children remain absent from that framing, their individuality incompatible with the narrative of progress. What lingers is not just the loss of lives but the normalization of their erasure, the ease with which institutions learn to look away, to translate suffering into acceptable terminology. The lesson was not confined to one empire or one era. It echoes wherever power encounters vulnerability and chooses efficiency over recognition. The orphans did not leave testimonies. They left data points, specimens, and gaps. Their disappearance is not a mystery in the conventional sense. It is a record of decisions made repeatedly, calmly, and with conviction. To trace it is to confront a history that prefers abstraction, and to recognize that what was buried was not only the bodies of children, but the responsibility for what was done to them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was maintained, curated, passed down as professionalism. It taught future generations what could be ignored in the pursuit of knowledge, and who could be used without consequence. In that sense, the laboratories never fully closed. They became internalized, their logic embedded in systems that learned from their success. At the edge of the surviving records, the story does not end so much as dissolve. Names fade into numbers, dates replace faces. What remains is a question without a ledger to contain it. How many lives can be consumed by progress before the cost is no longer considered exceptional, but expected? The expectation of disappearance did not end with the children. It extended outward, shaping how entire communities learned to understand loss. In districts where orphan houses once stood, generations grew accustomed to gaps in family histories, unexplained absences spoken of in lowered voices or not at all. A child who vanished was folded into a familiar narrative of misfortune, disease, or opportunity gone wrong. The truth required a scale of imagination that few were encouraged to exercise. What allowed the system to persist was not merely authority but participation. The laboratories depended on networks of compliance that reached into parishes, shipping offices, and households that prided themselves on moral instruction. Each participant performed a small role, insulated from the whole. A clerk copied names, a porter unlocked doors, a nurse restrained a child and told herself it was temporary. Responsibility was diluted through process. By the time an experiment began, culpability had already dispersed into abstraction. The science itself was often crude, but it carried the aura of inevitability. Measurements were repeated until patterns appeared, not because the patterns were reliable, but because repetition gave them weight. Conclusions were framed cautiously, then cited confidently by others. The bodies of children became instruments through which uncertainty was converted into authority. The pain endured in those rooms was transmuted into confidence elsewhere, into decisions affecting soldiers, laborers, and settlers who would never know the origin of the knowledge shaping their treatment. Some of the children survived long enough to be released. They were returned to institutions with scars that could not be explained and behaviors that marked them as difficult. They were labeled unruly, unstable, or ungrateful. The system that injured them then punished them for bearing evidence of that injury. Few found apprenticeships. Fewer still formed families. Their lives, when traced at all, were marked by confinement and early death. Survival did not equate to escape. It only extended the duration of consequence. The colonial authorities did not need to monitor these outcomes closely. Their interest ended when data was collected. The long-term effects on individual lives were irrelevant to objectives defined in decades rather than lifetimes. The children were valuable only while they were useful. Afterward, they re-entered the category from which they had been taken: expendable, forgettable, administratively invisible. As reform movements gathered strength in the late colonial period, they focused on visible abuses: public floggings, starvation, overt neglect. The laboratories remained largely untouched, protected by technical language and restricted access. Inspectors trained to identify cruelty were ill-equipped to recognize it when it presented itself as method. Consent forms were unnecessary when subjects were deemed incapable of autonomy. Ethical frameworks lagged behind practices already normalized. In correspondence from this period, one finds defensiveness rather than remorse. Authors anticipated criticism and preemptively reframed their work as misunderstood. They insisted that children were treated with care, that suffering was minimized, that outcomes justified means. They invoked future generations as beneficiaries, positioning themselves as reluctant participants in a necessary process. The children themselves were absent from these defenses, present only as categories. When empires collapsed or withdrew, responsibility dissolved further. Successor governments inherited buildings without records, practices without acknowledgement. The laboratories, stripped of funding, closed quietly. Equipment was sold or repurposed. Specimens were absorbed into new collections, their labels updated to reflect contemporary classifications. The past was not denied so much as overwritten. The silence that followed was not imposed by force. It was maintained by convenience. To excavate the truth would have required disrupting narratives of progress and benevolence that underpin national identity. It would have complicated commemorations and stained institutions eager to present themselves as humane. Forgetting was easier. Forgetting allowed continuity without accountability. Yet forgetting was never complete. In some families, stories persisted without context. A grandmother who refused hospitals, an uncle who reacted violently to confinement. These behaviors were pathologized, treated as individual failings rather than echoes of systemic harm. Trauma was privatized, its origins obscured by time and silence. Modern historians encounter this past obliquely. The archives resist linear reconstruction. Files end abruptly. References point to missing volumes. Marginal notes hint at practices never described. The absence itself becomes evidence, though of a kind difficult to present. It demands interpretation rather than citation. It challenges the comfort of definitive conclusions. What emerges slowly is an understanding of how cruelty can be institutionalized without overt malice. The men who designed and maintained the laboratories did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as rational actors within a hierarchy that rewarded results and discouraged reflection. Their moral horror lay not in sadism, but in indifference cultivated as professionalism. The orphans were not selected because they were weak, but because their weakness could be converted into utility. Their lives were stripped of narrative value, reduced to variables. In doing so, the system revealed something enduring about power, that it prefers subjects who cannot answer back, whose absence will not disrupt the story being told. The disappearance of these children is not confined to the past. It reverberates in contemporary debates about consent, vulnerability, and the ethics of research. The language has evolved, but the temptation remains to frame harm as necessary, to prioritize abstract benefit over concrete suffering. The colonial laboratories serve as a cautionary origin, though rarely acknowledged as such. At a certain point, the question shifts. It is no longer about uncovering every fact or naming every victim. That work, while important, cannot fully restore what was taken. The deeper challenge lies in recognizing the conditions that made such a system possible and acceptable. It requires examining how easily institutions can align around efficiency at the expense of humanity, and how silence becomes a form of participation. The orphan houses no longer stand, but their logic persists wherever care is conditional and oversight is fragmented. The laboratories no longer operate, but their methods echo in practices that separate subject from person, data from life. The children, whose names were erased to facilitate experimentation, remain absent from the official histories that benefited from their suffering. What remains is an unresolved moral inheritance. It cannot be neatly catalogued or closed. It lingers in the margins of progress, asking whether knowledge acquired through erasure can ever be fully disentangled from its origins. The story does not offer redemption. It offers only a recognition of what was made possible when silence was organized and vulnerability was treated as permission. In the end, the most effective concealment was not the destruction of records, but their preservation without context. Documents survived that listed expenditures for supplies, renovations to facilities, stipends for staff. Read alone, they suggested diligence, even care. Only when placed beside missing census entries and abrupt declines in orphan populations did they begin to suggest something else. Even then, interpretation required willingness. Evidence without intent remains inert. The children, reduced to measurements and outcomes, were never granted the dignity of uncertainty. Their pain was interpreted before it could be expressed, their resistance categorized as anomaly. In the rare instances where a child spoke back, where fear or anger disrupted procedure, it was recorded as interference, not testimony. The system had no vocabulary for protest that did not first strip it of meaning. What is most difficult to reconcile is how ordinary the participants found their work. There were no secret rites, no dramatic declarations of purpose. Days began with routine and ended with reports. The laboratories operated on schedules aligned with shipping timetables and academic calendars. The children's bodies were integrated into workflows designed to minimize disruption. Cruelty functioned best when it did not announce itself. Even now, attempts to memorialize the disappeared face resistance, not overt denial but hesitation. Questions about accuracy, scope, and relevance are raised. The absence of complete records is cited as reason for restraint. Caution becomes a continuation of silence. The children are asked once again to wait until conditions are suitable for acknowledgement. Yet history does not require permission to weigh upon the present. It persists in the shape of institutions and assumptions. The colonial laboratories were not aberrations. They were expressions of a worldview that ranked lives and allocated suffering accordingly. To confront that legacy is to risk unsettling narratives of benevolence that remain comforting. The orphans were never meant to be remembered individually. Their utility depended on anonymity. What survives instead is the structure that consumed them, and the knowledge that such structures rarely dismantle themselves voluntarily. They adapt, rename, relocate. They learn from scrutiny and refine their methods. In tracing this history, one encounters a boundary beyond which certainty dissolves. Numbers blur, stories fragment. The temptation is to stop, to declare the past irretrievable. But the disappearance of the children was not total. It was partial by design. Enough remains to reveal intention, if not every detail. The quiet horror lies in that intention's calmness. There was no urgency to end suffering, only to manage it efficiently. The children were not hated. They were simply not valued enough to matter. That distinction, thin as it is, sustained the system more effectively than overt violence ever could. At this point, the narrative resists continuation in the usual sense. There is no final discovery, no decisive reckoning. The story settles instead into a space of unresolved responsibility. It asks what it means to inherit knowledge built on erased lives, and whether acknowledgement alone can alter that inheritance. The laboratories are gone. The orphan houses are gone. The children remain absent. What endures is the silence that once protected the system, now repurposed as distance. To listen closely is to hear not voices, but the mechanisms that ensured they would never be heard. Silence, once established, acquires its own authority. It no longer needs enforcement. It teaches itself. Those who inherit institutions shaped by it learn instinctively which questions advance careers and which ones stall them. The absence of the children becomes a boundary marker, an unspoken agreement about where inquiry should end. Curiosity is redirected towards safer archives, safer subjects. In some cases, fragments surface not through intention but accident. A renovation uncovers a sealed room. An inventory reveals specimens whose origins cannot be traced. These moments generate brief unease, followed by procedural containment. Items are reclassified. Rooms are documented and closed. The language of compliance absorbs the disruption. What cannot be explained is stored. What cannot be stored is quietly removed. The moral weight of this history does not rest solely on those who designed the laboratories. It extends to those who benefited from the knowledge without asking how it was obtained. To read a medical text is to participate in a lineage of assumptions about whose bodies were acceptable to study, whose pain was considered informative rather than intolerable. The orphans occupy the foundation of that lineage, invisible yet indispensable. What distinguishes this history from others of exploitation is its intimacy. The children were not worked to exhaustion in open fields or transported in chains across oceans. They were handled carefully, examined closely, spoken to softly even as harm was done. The proximity between caretaker and subject blurred moral boundaries. Harm delivered at close range required emotional management, not brute force. Detachment became a skill cultivated and rewarded. In this way, the laboratories functioned as training grounds not only for techniques, but for a particular disposition toward suffering. One learned to observe without intervening, to record without reacting. These habits extended beyond the laboratory walls, influencing how practitioners responded to pain elsewhere. The capacity to look and not act became a mark of professionalism. The orphans, lacking advocates, absorbed the full weight of this disposition. Their suffering taught others how to endure proximity to harm without acknowledgement. That lesson proved transferable. It outlived the colonial context that produced it. As generations passed, the absence of the children was naturalized. They were not remembered as victims, because victimhood implies an event, a rupture. Instead, they were treated as a statistical inevitability, a background condition of a harsher time. This framing dissolved responsibility into atmosphere. No one could be blamed for the error. Yet atmosphere is constructed. It is maintained through repetition and reinforcement. The colonial laboratories were not hidden because they were shameful. They were hidden because concealment optimized function. Visibility would have complicated logistics. It would have required justification beyond internal consensus. Silence was not moral failure alone. It was operational strategy. To acknowledge this is unsettling, because it suggests that similar strategies may persist wherever efficiency and authority intersect. The orphan's disappearance warns not of monstrous individuals, but of systems that reward indifference and penalize disruption. It shows how easily care can be redefined as control and protection as access. There is no moment in the record where the practice is universally condemned. There are only shifts in emphasis, changes in language, gradual withdrawals. The absence of a clear reckoning allows the past to remain unfinished. It continues to exert pressure without resolution. In studying what remains, one is left with impressions rather than answers. The faint outline of a child's hand traced in a margin. A note questioning an outcome, crossed out and replaced with a more acceptable phrase. These traces do not accuse. They endure. They resist erasure by refusing to cohere into a narrative that can be neatly concluded. The story, then, does not end with closure, but with recognition of limits of archives, limits of restitution, limits of certainty. The orphans cannot be restored to the record in full. Their lives cannot be reassembled from fragments. What can be recovered is the knowledge that their disappearance was neither accidental nor inevitable. This knowledge carries its own burden. It asks not for mourning alone, but for vigilance. It challenges the listener to consider where similar silences might be operating now, under different names, with different justifications. It unsettles the comfort of believing such histories belong entirely to the past. The laboratories were places where children learned, too late, that care could be conditional and protection reversible. The world beyond those walls absorbed the benefits and forgot the cost. That forgetting was not passive. It was maintained through habits of attention and neglect that continue to shape how histories are written and taught. The narrative reaches a pause not because everything has been said, but because what remains cannot be resolved through narration alone. The absence at its center resists completion. It insists on being carried forward as a question rather than sealed as an answer. Time does not correct silence. It deepens it, layering distance over omission until absence feels like fact rather than choice. The colonial laboratories relied on this property of time. They did not need to erase everything. only enough that recovery would require effort exceeding appetite. They trusted that future generations would inherit institutions before they inherited questions. When later scholars attempted to trace the origins of certain practices, they often encountered defensive neutrality. The past was framed as complex, context-bound, resistant to judgment. Moral hesitation was presented as intellectual rigor. In this way, the language of scholarship became another buffer, protecting uncomfortable truths from scrutiny by insisting on balance where imbalance had defined the system itself. The orphans, stripped of context even in death, were denied the possibility of meaning. Their suffering was not permitted to signify injustice, it was rendered incidental. This is perhaps the most enduring harm. Pain that cannot signify is easily repeated. It teaches nothing except efficiency. There are moments, however, rare, when the silence falters, when a descendant recognizes a pattern in family records, when a collection curator questions why certain specimens lack provenance. These moments are fragile. They depend on individuals willing to tolerate discomfort without immediate resolution. They often end without public acknowledgement, absorbed back into private awareness. The history of the laboratories resists dramatization. There are no singular villains, no climactic exposures. The harm unfolded through routine. That ordinariness is what makes it difficult to hold. It implicates systems rather than personalities, habits rather than intentions. It suggests that ethical collapse can occur not through transgression but through alignment. The children were aligned with procedures, schedules, and objectives that did not account for their humanity. Their bodies became sites where abstraction was tested and refined. The distance between intention and impact widened until it was no longer visible to those operating within it. What remains unresolved is not simply a historical injustice, but a methodological one. How to write about lives designed to leave no trace. How to speak of suffering that was deliberately anonymized. The temptation is to fill gaps with narrative certainty, to impose coherence. But doing so risks repeating the original erasure, substituting interpretation for testimony. Instead, the gaps must remain visible. They must be acknowledged as products of power rather than accidents of time. The missing names are not failures of research, they are outcomes of a system that understood the value of disappearance. The colonial laboratories no longer require defense. Their logic has diffused into broader practices that continue to negotiate the boundary between knowledge and harm. The orphan's absence lingers as a reminder of how easily vulnerability can be converted into resource when oversight fragments and accountability dissolves. This is where the narrative holds, not in resolution, but in suspension. The past does not close. It waits, pressing quietly against the present, asking what conditions allow such systems to form and persist. The question does not demand an answer so much as attention. Attention, however, is difficult to sustain without spectacle. The history of the orphan laboratories offers none. It offers instead a study in administrative patience. The children were taken slowly, consistently, in numbers small enough to avoid disruption. Each disappearance was absorbable. No single moment demanded response. The accumulation was the event, and accumulation rarely alarms until it is complete. This method shaped how memory itself would fail. Large atrocities invite reckoning because they rupture expectation. This one conformed to it. Orphans were expected to suffer. Colonial medicine was expected to be harsh. Progress was expected to require sacrifice. The laboratories fit neatly into these assumptions, and so passed beneath moral notice. Even when later ethical standards emerged, they were framed forward, not backward. New rules governed future conduct, leaving past actions untouched. Accountability was replaced by improvement. The children became collateral to a narrative of advancement, their suffering repurposed as proof that lessons had been learned, even when those lessons were partial. What is striking is how little effort was required to maintain this arrangement. No grand conspiracy was necessary, only shared incentives and mutual discretion. Each institution protected itself by protecting the silence of others. Exposure threatened not only reputations, but the legitimacy of entire fields built atop inherited knowledge. The orphans, lacking descendants who could organize memory on their behalf, remained unrepresented. Their absence simplified history. It allowed clean lines of progress, uninterrupted by ethical debris. To include them would have required slowing the story, complicating it, admitting that advancement was neither neutral nor evenly distributed in its costs. In this sense, the laboratories succeeded beyond their immediate aims. They demonstrated a model for extracting value from vulnerability while minimizing resistance. That model did not disappear with the empire. It migrated, adapted, and found new expressions wherever oversight lagged behind ambition. The moral horror is not confined to what was done, but to how easily it was forgotten. Forgetting became a secondary harm, ensuring that suffering produced benefit without burden. The children paid twice, first with their bodies, then with their absence from memory. To encounter this history is to stand before an incomplete ledger. It cannot be balanced. No number of acknowledgments can equal the lives consumed. What can be done is limited, but not meaningless. Refusal to smooth over gaps, refusal to treat silence as neutrality. These are modest acts, but they resist the logic that made the laboratories possible. The story does not ask for absolution. It does not offer redemption. It asks only that the listener recognize how ordinary systems can commit extraordinary harm when vulnerability is administratively convenient. It asks for unease rather than closure. The children remain unnamed. The rooms where they were studied remain unmarked. What persists is the knowledge that disappearance can be engineered and that history, left unattended, will often cooperate. The narrative settles here, not because the past has finished speaking, but because it has said what it was designed to say, that silence is not empty and absence is not accidental. What follows after recognition is often uncertainty. Institutions prefer certainty. They prefer statements that can be archived, policies that can be cited, lessons that can be summarized. This history resists all three. It does not condense into guidance without losing its substance. Its significance lies in what it refuses to resolve. The colonial laboratories operated on the assumption that some lives could be postponed indefinitely, that justice could wait. That explanation was optional. These assumptions did not collapse with the buildings that housed them. They linger in how contemporary systems categorize risk, consent, and expendability. The vocabulary has softened. The structure remains. To sit with this past is to accept discomfort without instruction. There is no prescribed response, no ceremony capable of compensating for what was taken. Memorials, where they exist, risk aestheticizing loss, turning erasure into symbol. The children did not disappear to become metaphors. They disappeared to make other things possible. What the record ultimately reveals is not only what was done, but how little resistance absence encounters once normalized. The orphan laboratories thrived because they aligned with prevailing hierarchies of worth. Children without names, without advocates, without futures imagined for them. These were bodies the system could afford to lose. Their disappearance confirmed the hierarchy rather than disrupting it. The danger lies in assuming that such hierarchies are relics. They are not. They reappear wherever vulnerability is framed as opportunity, wherever care is conditional upon utility. The past does not repeat itself precisely. It refines itself. There is a temptation at this point to search for moral distance, to reassure oneself that awareness alone constitutes separation. But awareness without consequence risks becoming another form of containment, a way of acknowledging harm without altering the conditions that enable it. The orphans left no final statements. They left no appeals. What remains is the shape of a system that learned how to make disappearance function smoothly. That knowledge, unlike the children, was preserved carefully, transmitted without annotation. The narrative cannot offer an ending that restores balance. It can only pause, allowing the weight of what has been traced to settle without resolution. The absence at its center remains intact, resisting conversion into lesson or legacy. The pause that follows is not empty. It is occupied by the recognition that systems capable of such quiet harm do not announce themselves when they return. They arrive disguised as improvement, as efficiency, as care reorganized for scale. The colonial laboratories were not sustained by secrecy alone, but by credibility. They were trusted because they spoke the language of order and advancement. That trust, once granted, proved durable. To trace this history forward is to notice how often vulnerability is still framed as availability, how frequently consent is inferred from circumstance rather than given. The orphans were never asked. Their silence was interpreted as compliance. This logic persists wherever power assumes the right to decide which voices matter. The difficulty in closing the story lies in the absence of rupture. There is no moment when the world clearly changes in response to what was done. The laboratories did not fall under the weight of revelation. They faded as priorities shifted, their work absorbed and normalized. The lack of consequence is itself a conclusion, though not a comforting one. What endures instead is a moral residue, difficult to locate but impossible to dismiss. It surfaces when institutions resist transparency in the name of complexity, when historical harm is acknowledged only in general terms, stripped of specificity, when the past is treated as a completed chapter rather than an active influence. The children, whose lives were reduced to instruments, remain beyond restoration. Their absence cannot be repaired by narrative attention alone, but it can be honored by refusing to allow disappearance to pass as inevitability, by recognizing that silence is often maintained because it is useful, not because it is true. This history does not ask to be resolved. It asks to be held without dilution, to be allowed its discomfort, to resist the impulse to move on too quickly, to convert recognition into reassurance. The laboratories depended on forward motion without reflection. To slow that motion, even briefly, is to disrupt their legacy. The story rests here, incomplete by necessity. What was erased cannot be fully recovered. What can be carried forward is an awareness sharpened by restraint, an understanding that the most enduring harms are often those committed calmly, with paperwork in order and voices lowered. There is a temptation, when confronted with such histories, to search for a threshold, a point beyond which responsibility fades, where the passage of time transforms action into artifact. The Colonial laboratories invite that temptation. They seem distant, embedded in conditions no longer present, staffed by men long dead. Yet the systems that enabled them did not require cruelty to be passionate. They required it to be administratively quiet. What survives most clearly is the method of separating harm from intention, of fragmenting responsibility until no single participant feels implicated, of trusting that oversight, once deferred, will never fully return. These methods did not vanish with the children. They proved adaptable, portable, and efficient. The orphans were rendered legible only in fragments, ages without names, outcomes without stories. This fragmentation was essential. A whole life invites empathy. A data point invites analysis. The laboratories perfected the transformation from one to the other. In doing so, they taught a lesson that outlived them, that suffering, when sufficiently abstracted, can be managed without moral cost. The absence of closure is not a failure of the narrative. It is faithful to the experience it traces. The children did not receive explanations. They did not receive endings. Their lives were interrupted, redirected, dissolved into processes that did not account for continuity. To impose resolution now would be to grant what was denied then. What remains then is a form of attention that does not seek to complete the story, but to keep it unresolved, to allow the discomfort to persist without converting it into instruction or spectacle. This is a fragile stance. It resists the habits of both history and entertainment, which prefer conclusions. The Colonial laboratories remind us that the most effective systems of harm are those that appear reasonable to those within them. They do not rely on secrecy alone, but on consensus, on shared assumptions about whose lives matter enough to interrupt progress. The orphans were excluded from that calculus, and so their disappearance became functional. The story pauses here, not because it has reached an end, but because it has reached the limit of what narration can responsibly do. Beyond this point lies judgment, action, or forgetting. Those choices cannot be scripted. The limit is not silence itself, but how easily silence is mistaken for neutrality. The Colonial laboratories relied on that confusion. They operated within moral gray zones carefully cultivated to appear unavoidable. When no alternative is imagined, harm presents itself as necessity. The children were not framed as victims of choice, but of circumstance. That framing absolved decision-makers while preserving efficiency. To understand this is to recognize that moral horror does not always announce itself with outrage. Sometimes it arrives as resignation, as the quiet acceptance that certain losses are unfortunate but tolerable. The orphan laboratories were built on that acceptance, reinforced by social hierarchies that ranked grief itself. Some deaths were mourned, others were absorbed. The children's disappearance did not destabilize the colonial order because it confirmed it. It demonstrated that those without lineage or protection could be repurposed without consequence. That lesson reinforced power, making future decisions easier. Once disappearance is normalized, escalation requires little justification. In the surviving correspondence, there are moments where language falters. A sentence ends abruptly. A margin note questions an outcome, then retreats into technical phrasing. These are not confessions. They are signs of pressure, brief encounters with doubt that did not alter direction. The system did not require the absence of conscience, only its containment. What is striking is how often care and harm occupied the same gesture. A child was cleaned before being restrained, spoken to gently before an incision. These details complicate the impulse to categorize actors as purely cruel. They reveal a more unsettling truth, that harm can be delivered through routines that feel humane to those performing them. That kindness, when subordinated to hierarchy, does not prevent abuse. It facilitates it. The orphans were taught, briefly, to trust. That trust was instrumental. It reduced resistance, eased procedure. Its betrayal was not acknowledged as betrayal because the children were never granted the status of equals. Their expectations were not considered binding. As the story stretches forward, it becomes less about the past than about endurance, about how systems built on erasure persist by teaching successors what not to notice. The laboratories are gone, but the discipline of looking away remains a transferable skill. The narrative does not advance toward resolution. It circles, slowly, around the absence at its center. Each pass reveals another layer of normalization, another way silence was preserved. The children do not return. They do not speak. The weight of their absence accumulates instead, resisting conversion into lesson or closure. At some point, continuation risks repetition. The same patterns reassert themselves: authority, vulnerability, efficiency, silence. This repetition is itself instructive. It mirrors how the system functioned, sustained by routine rather than innovation. The story rests again, not finished, not concluded. It waits in the space between acknowledgement and action, where history often lingers longest. What remains to be said narrows rather than expands. The closer one moves to the center of this history, the fewer words seem adequate. The colonial laboratories did not depend on grand theories of superiority. They depended on a simpler conviction that some lives could be delayed, deferred, or redirected without moral urgency. That conviction did not require hatred. It required only hierarchy. The children were positioned at the bottom of that hierarchy, not by accident, but by design. Orphanhood was not merely a condition, it was an administrative category that signaled availability. To be without guardianship was to be without interruption. The system learned to read that absence as permission. This reading shaped how suffering was processed. Pain became information, fear became noise to be managed, death became an outcome to be documented, not mourned. The laboratories refined a way of seeing that stripped experience of claim. Once learned, that way of seeing did not remain confined to children. It expanded outward, influencing how other vulnerable bodies were approached. The difficulty of this history is not only in its cruelty, but in its success. The laboratories achieved what they set out to do. They produced knowledge, they advanced careers, they informed policy. Their efficiency validated their methods. In systems governed by results, success becomes its own justification. To confront that success is unsettling. It complicates the comfort of believing that harm inevitably undermines itself. Here, harm was productive. It worked. That fact demands a different kind of reckoning, one that does not rely on failure as evidence of wrongdoing. The children's disappearance thus occupies an uncomfortable position. It is neither scandal nor tragedy in the conventional sense. It is infrastructure. It is the unseen foundation upon which visible progress was built. To acknowledge it is to admit that some advancements are inseparable from the suffering they obscure. The narrative cannot move forward without risking dilution. Each additional word risks smoothing what should remain jagged. The absence at the heart of the story must be allowed to remain unresolved, resisting incorporation into a redemptive arc. The laboratories are no longer operational. The orphan houses no longer receive children. But the question persists, quiet and persistent. What other silences are being maintained now, under the assurance of necessity and order? The story pauses here again, not because it is finished, but because it has reached the edge of what can be carried in language alone. Beyond this edge, the past no longer offers new images, only deeper implications. The colonial laboratories recede into abstraction not because they are unknowable, but because they were designed to resist moral focus. They trained attention away from individuals and toward outcomes. In doing so, they modeled a way of thinking that remains familiar. The children were never asked to consent because consent would have acknowledged them as participants rather than material. Participation implies agency. Agency implies obligation. The system avoided both by redefining the children as wards, dependents, cases. Language did the work of removal before any hand was raised. What lingers is the realization that erasure does not require violence to be visible. It requires continuity. The laboratories did not shock the conscience of their time because they aligned with prevailing assumptions about worth and purpose. The children's lives were considered incomplete, unfinished, already interrupted by misfortune. That framing made further interruption seem less severe. In this way, disappearance became cumulative rather than singular. Each child vanished into a process already normalized by previous vanishings. The first disappearance mattered, the 100th confirmed expectation. By the time numbers grew noticeable, concern had already been trained out of the system. The difficulty of reckoning with this history lies in its refusal to provide moral distance. There is no clear line separating past from present, them from us. The mechanisms are recognizable. The language is familiar. The justification's echo softened but intact. To carry this awareness forward is not to accuse indiscriminately, but to recognize patterns. To notice when vulnerability is framed as opportunity, when oversight is deferred in the name of expertise, when absence is explained away as inevitability rather than investigated as design. The children did not disappear into mystery, they disappeared into method. Their lives were absorbed by a system that valued what could be extracted over what could be preserved. That system did not collapse under scrutiny. It faded, leaving behind habits of thought more enduring than buildings or records. The narrative slows here, not toward conclusion, but toward stillness. The past does not resolve. It settles, heavy and incomplete. What remains is the knowledge that silence can be engineered, that disappearance can be organized, and that progress, left unquestioned, will often accept both. The final silence is not an ending. It is a condition that remains once all explanations have been exhausted and all documents have failed to speak. The colonial laboratories did not close with confession or apology. They closed the way many systems close, by becoming unnecessary. by being absorbed, by leaving behind no single moment that demanded remembrance. The children did not receive endings. Their lives were interrupted and redirected into processes that did not recognize continuity. To give them a conclusion now would be an invention. An invention would soften what must remain difficult. What can be offered instead is a refusal to resolve what was never resolved for them. The weight of this history lies in its ordinariness. Nothing about it required exceptional cruelty. It required only alignment between authority and ambition, between silence and efficiency, between vulnerability and access. Once aligned, the system sustained itself with little effort. The disappearance of children became part of how things were done. What endures is the knowledge that harm does not always announce itself as harm. It can arrive as care reorganized, as protection redefined, as necessity spoken calmly. The colonial laboratories remind us that moral horror often hides not in excess but in restraint, in the measured tone, the tidy ledger, the lowered voice. There is no restoration available to those who vanished. No accounting can return what was taken. The absence remains, not as a gap to be filled, but as a presence that unsettles any story of uncomplicated progress. It asks what was required to build what followed, and who was made invisible so that building could proceed uninterrupted. The story ends where it began, with disappearance treated as administrative success. To sit with that recognition is uncomfortable, and meant to be. It resists the comfort of distance and the ease of closure. It leaves the listener not with answers, but with a sharpened awareness of how easily silence can be organized, and how rarely it dissolves on its own. Nothing more can be added without diminishing what must remain unresolved. The children are still absent. The systems that learned from their absence remain. Between them lies a quiet inheritance, waiting to be noticed or ignored again.